All right, I think we're on. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started shortly. In the meantime, feel free to drop where you're tuning in from in the chat. Ooh, all over the place. Love it. John, I am also in Indianapolis. Amazing. Okay, well, let's get started. Hey, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar, How Legal and Compliance Leaders Build a Robust Compliance Culture. Before we get started, I want to give you a quick overview of what we're going to be covering in today's discussion. We plan to cover a variety of topics related to compliance, everything from creating a compliance program to getting buy-in on compliance initiatives to maintaining a really strong program as your organization gets bigger and bigger. We'll wrap up with some live Q&A, so be sure to drop any questions you have in the chat. We'll be taking stock, and we'll try and get to as many as we can at the end. My name is Nicole Tobias, and I will be moderating today's discussion. I am Senior Legal Counsel at Ironclad, and my primary focus is on compliance, data privacy, and security. I'm really happy to be joined today by Lisa and Martha. I'd love to start this off by having each of you tell us a little bit about yourselves. Lisa, let's start with you. Can you tell everyone what company you work for and what your role is?
Sure. I'm Lisa Salinas Schneider. I'm the VP of Legal and Compliance at SpyCloud. We're a cybersecurity firm headquartered out of Austin, Texas. We have a pretty robust presence in the cybersecurity marketplace for products such as dark web monitoring and post-infection remediation. Prior to this, I worked at another startup in MarTech, and I've been a lawyer at Apple and Xerox.
How about you? Where are you at and what's your role?
Hi, everyone. I'm Martha Wrangham. I'm General Counsel of One Study Team, which is based out of Boston, Massachusetts. And as General Counsel, I head up the legal and compliance function for our company. One Study Team is a cloud software and services company that focuses on supporting the clinical research space. So that's where we operate. And our software and services are available in over 100 countries. So we're definitely kept busy with that, the span of our presence.
Amazing. Well, I'm super excited to have you both here with us today. And for everyone in attendance, thank you so much for submitting your questions during registration. We're going to use them to help guide the conversation today. But as I mentioned already, we are finishing with a live Q&A, so please drop any questions in the chat and we will get to them. Let's get started. I would love to start by understanding a little bit more about each of your backgrounds. Martha, can you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you ended up leading the compliance function at your company?
For sure, yeah. So my background originally was in data privacy, actually. I spent about 10 years sort of honing that specialty. And then I moved into my first in-house role. And there I started to become more of a generalist, which I think is probably an experience many of you who are in-house can relate to. So yeah, once I joined One Study Team, I think their primary focus was having a strong privacy leader in-house, but being the first in-house attorney hired to the company at the time, you start turning over rocks, you learn a little bit more about process and sort of how things are running, and I think from there it was kind of an organic journey to identify areas of opportunity to kind of build out that compliance muscle from internally, and here we are today with with a function that's now sort of humming and in maintenance mode, which is really exciting to be at that place.
Lisa, same question. What's your background and how did you end up leading compliance at your company?
Sure. So my background's very different from Martha's, actually, though there are some alignments. My background is in commercial contracting. So I started off doing contracts at Xerox and then again at Apple. And then I was the first legal hire at my last company, where I went from really more focusing on commercial contracting to being more of a generalist, taking over sort of other areas of legal needs as these saw them arise. And then I came to SpyCloud 4 years ago. And at the time, we had a GRC manager who was my peer. We both reported into the CFO. He left to go focus on a more privacy-related role, and I went to our mutual boss and pitched taking over compliance. And so that's how I wound up, taking over that function and leading that program.
I love both of your kind of paths to taking on this role. There's really no one path. I think you're showing us that there's many ways to get into this business. I'd like to talk about building the compliance program because I think that's something that both of you are familiar with. I know when I started Ironclad, our compliance program consisted of one legal ops person and one person on the operations team. We didn't have a security team, let alone any sort of like formal compliance program. That function really started when I joined, and then our CISO joined like very soon after I joined. Martha, how did you build out your compliance program? What did that process look like?
Yeah, so we were fortunate to have kind of a pretty strong security and privacy backbone in place. Just the nature of our business being, a platform that handles a lot of protected health information or other sensitive health data. Those were kind of the areas that the team leaned into first before I even joined. So kind of being able to inherit that backbone was really nice. It gave me an opportunity to and by the way, security does not roll up to me. So that was right away like a really strong partnership that I was able to enjoy. But I was when I mentioned a minute ago, kind of turning over rocks and seeing areas of opportunity to start building. For me, what I honed in on was just generally kind of the topic of third-party relationships. I felt like there was a lot of space for us to kind of tighten how we oversee those relationships and manage them, and maybe strengthen our documentation around how those relationships are managed. So right away, contracting and then supplier and partner qualification were on my plate, and I think from there it was kind of a spider web where the minute you start poking at that one thing, policies start coming out of the woodwork. You're talking about building SOPs. And so I mentioned before, it was like a really organic process. Even if you on your own, build journey, don't start by honing in on third-party relationships the way I did. Wherever you start, my suspicion is that you're still gonna experience that web phenomenon where one thing kind of trickles into the next, and suddenly you're kind of everywhere. So that's how it went for me.
That's great. Lisa, what about you? What did that process look like, and what kind of hires did you make?
So we fortunately already had a GRC sort of headcount in place when I took over the function. It was a matter of finding someone to take over that role. We spent a lot of time talking to a lot of candidates and found someone who we are really incredibly proud of. She's really great at building relationships, sort of translating technical compliance requirements into language that sort of our less technical folks on the leadership side can understand. And she's been really instrumental in coordinating with security operations, which was not a team that we had when we launched our compliance function, and sort of coordinating with that team as well as with the engineering and product teams to really achieve a lot of our technical compliance objectives. From other compliance, requirements, HR, legal compliance, we also look for, people in those roles who are aligned with sort of our corporate mission of a culture of compliance. Like by virtue of what we do, we have a lot of emphasis on security, respect for confidentiality in our hiring processes. And so it's been really helpful for us as we build out these programs to have that sort of culture in place as we make the hires in these roles.
Yeah, that's great. On hiring, Martha, how did you build out your team? What kind of hires did you make?
Yeah, so like many legal teams and many compliance teams, there aren't, we weren't first in line to have a ton of resources at our fingertips. And so you have to be scrappy and you have to kind of work with what you have. I was really fortunate to be able to hire, I think one key hire early on who I think might be on the phone right now. Hi, Senna. So Senna was one of our first team members beyond me, and I would say, she joined us in a relatively junior role, sort of at the associate level, and her background was really strong in privacy and contracting, which, as I mentioned, were kind of the two initial focal areas for me. Um, the great thing about bringing in somebody like Sana, sorry to keep mentioning you, is that I think she was early enough in her career to be open and flexible and willing to learn, which has been a huge, huge benefit to us. And I hope also to her. Because at this point, a few years in, Senna has, become more senior in our organization and is my utility player. She's gotten to know the business from so many different angles. It's really invaluable to have had someone kind of join early on and grow with the team that way, because she's the opposite of siloed. I mean, she can plug into anything, and it's extremely helpful, especially in a situation where you can't necessarily hire for every need that you have.
I think you both have highlighted some really great points on for smaller teams like ours that it's just really important to make strategic hires and make sure you're hiring people that get it. And it sounds like was a priority for both of you. For Ironclad, compliance is a huge cross-functional effort. I mean, I work with stakeholders across the organization in all the different departments, which can make getting buy-in on compliance initiatives somewhat of a challenge. I'm really curious how both of you navigate this. Lisa, how do you build support and get buy-in for compliance initiatives?
Sure. My perspective is probably really driven by my commercial contracting background, right? So being on the front lines of customer interactions, what they're asking for, what they want from us in order to drive revenue has been really helpful. Where I can negotiate out certain compliance things, I will. But for the most part, clients impose their will on us. And we're at a late stage startup. We were sort of at a mid stage startup when I joined. We've quadrupled our ARR in the time that I've been here, at least. RevOps is probably going to tell me that I undersold that number a little bit. And so, especially following big things like the SolarWinds breach, where people were really cracking down on sort of their vendor security requirements and third-party risk management, it's been super critical for us to sort of communicate that across the organization and help those functions understand that we need to achieve these objectives in order to keep growing at the trajectory that we have been and what we've promised to our stakeholders. So a lot of our buy-in on compliance initiatives is really driven by revenue and a commitment to obtaining revenue. And once you start putting dollars on that, if we do this, then it helps us achieve this amount of revenue. It becomes a lot easier. I'm not going to say it's easy, but it will be a lot easier. You can make your case a lot better when you have the data to back it up. That goes straight to the bottom line.
Oh, I love that. That's that I like to call that the carrot approach.
Yes, yes, we try to keep the
one
carrots instead of the sticks. Occasionally, we have to break out the sticks.
Yeah, I love that. It's definitely I try and do that at Ironclad as well. Martha, what about you? Do you have a similar approach to getting buy-in, or what's your process for that?
Yeah, so Lisa makes a great point about kind of pointing to the bottom line or data to compel your colleagues. But I will speak also to the those scenarios where you can't necessarily point to a revenue driver, but it's still important, right? There's a lot about compliance that kind of falls into that bucket. And from my perspective and from my experience, it's been really, really important to build an incredibly solid foundation of trust with my partners across the company. I think a lot of different people in different roles would probably say something similar, even if you're not kind of wearing the legal or compliance hat. Trust is really important. Relationship building is really important to get buy-in. But I think it's extra, quadruple extra important for someone in like the compliance space to be mindful of trust building, because a lot of we kind of inherit some stigma sometimes, or people don't really want to hear from us. It's not everyone's favorite day when the compliance leader comes like knocking on your door uninvited, right? And so right away when I joined the company, I focused on being approachable, being authentic, and I think part of authenticity is accountability. Those can be hard to be, especially when you're trying to establish yourself as a leader and trying to get people um, to sort of follow the rules you're trying to put into place. But it's that approachability that I think is the start to that trust building, because it means people, before too long, people are hoping to come talk to you about this thing because you've proven yourself to be a part, like a resource and almost like a safety net or a comfort zone for them, right? Like rather than going to the legal or compliance team feeling fearful that you're going to get in trouble, even if you've done something that you're like, oops, there's an oops. Still being approachable and still being a partner to that person is like the most important in those moments because you're on the same team. Um, and I think that just starts to build that foundation of trust. And when people trust you and they know you're a good human being at the end of the day, um, you you can collaborate much more successfully.
I think that's such an impactful perspective. I mean, compliance and legal are typically departments seen as like no department. Like you come to them and they're just going to tell you no, or they're going to tell you you're doing something wrong, or make you feel bad. So I love your perspective and your approach and being approachable and just liked and seen in a positive way throughout the organization. I think that's great. A strategy that's worked really well for me in this regard, and getting buy-in and working well with people, has been a really close partnership with our CISO. I often find that if he and I are aligned on an initiative, it's so much easier to get buy-in and get our initiatives tackled. I'm curious for each of you if there are one or a few key stakeholders that you kind of rely on in a similar capacity, and if so, who they are. Martha, let's start with you.
Yeah, I find that my fellow kind of corporate stewards, everyone's kind of a steward of the company to some extent, but really, like you mentioned, your CISO, right? Information security, finance, people team, these functions that aren't necessarily like out front driving sales, but they're doing so much to support that compliant culture across the company. Um, those partners have been crucial in my experience. And yeah, I don't think we could have gotten done any of the things that we've accomplished over the last few years without their partnership.
Lisa, what about you? Who do you partner with?
I mean, same as Martha and you, we are always talking to our CISO, right? Because he's got both IT and security operations. And so we have to be very aligned sort of with those teams to make sure that the controls that we're monitoring and operating are being successful. I work very closely with HR, both on from compliance perspective, but also as just sort of legal, right? So my role and Martha's role too, I think we have to look at things from both like a legal and a compliance perspective, and those are slightly different perspectives. But it is pretty critical, like she said, to always be available, always be authentic, always be somebody that people can come to. And then lastly, our CFO, because she's the money lady, right? So, if we've got to launch a new compliance initiative, we talk really closely with finance to make sure that it's viable, that it's doable, and that we can use the resources that we need access to, because we can't do everything in-house. We have one person, since Martha shouted out her personal shout out, Leah. Leah's amazing. And she works so hard, and she's done such amazing work while she's been here for the last 3 years. But sometimes we need a little bit more. So we have to go get the budget to get consultants coming in to help us move things at the speed that we need them to. And so, of course, we have to work really closely with finance and our CFO to make sure that that can happen.
That's great. I love that. I also love the shout outs. I hope they're on the, I hope they're listening and they hear the love, but
yeah,
I love it. So we talked about getting buy-in from different stakeholders. Another question I get asked a lot is how to get buy-in from the rest of the company. So, one of my favorite sayings at Ironclad, and it's a very common saying, I think, around Ironclad, at least in the legal and security teams, is that security is a team sport. And I think compliance is a team sport too. And security and compliance tend to go pretty hand in hand. Um, do you have advice or best practices on how to get the company aligned on like wider compliance initiatives like annual security training or annual policy acknowledgements? Lisa, I'm curious to start with you.
Sure. This is one of my stick moments, right? Like this is one of those like I just have to show up and tell people to get it done. We have a security training. We have tools that we use that we set it, and we work with HR to sort of align all of the trainings that we need to have at the same time, so we're not peppering people throughout the year with a bunch of trainings they need to take. But there's always somebody who doesn't want to do it, who does it last. I think last year I was the last one to get it done. Um, so people are chasing me down, but sometimes like I will just send an email that's like, hey, I see that you're not doing this. Can you please get this done? It needs to be done immediately. And that happens. Leadership is pretty easy to get buy-in from as things trickle down. If you've been able to set the stage with a department leader who can, understand and really grasp what you're trying to achieve, they can usually do a pretty good job of sort of flowing that down. But on, really company-wide initiatives, sometimes you just kind of have to break out the stick, break out the title, and show up to somebody and say like, hey, I really need you to get this done, or I need this piece of information, and sort of relationship manage your way through that.
I feel you on that. It sucks to have to be like, hey, you're the reason we might not get recertified this year. You're the reason that we might have a bad report. Do you want that on your? Yeah, no, I feel
I
that.
very much had one year I had to go to our CEO and I was like, I literally cannot press the button for you. Like, I really need you, the CEO of a cybersecurity company, to take this 20-minute like security training. Can you just please do it? And he was like, fine. And the next year it was me. So yeah.
I always feel so bad, but it does often like involve, some higher ups. Yeah, that's always an uncomfortable conversation to have. Martha, what about you? How do you get your organization to comply with this kind of stuff that you need done?
Yeah, I unfortunately haven't figured out the secret sauce to getting people to like sign themselves up for training and ask to take more. But I think it's out there somewhere. Aside from those stick moments, I do think those same things I mentioned earlier about getting buy-in from the kind of leadership also are really important when you're trying to get buy-in from the entire company, especially the approachability and the authenticity, right? Because at that point, you kind of have to remember that, like, I don't know, I work really hard to fight against any sort of idea that I'm in an ivory tower somewhere, or that it's really about just kind of again, just like being human and approachable. And I think that opens a lot of doors. And I guess my thought on being approachable and kind of an additional thought I have when it comes to like the broader company population is that like answering questions by also including the why is really, really important, because it's certainly easy to say like, don't do this, right? Or like, I would like for you to do this other thing. I feel like when you explain why it's important, that's automatic buy-in, because people want to do the right thing. Um, and you're also empowering your colleagues to go forth and have similar conversations with others within the company. And so your reach expands that way. And I think empowering folks to understand the why arms you with like an army of issue spotters, really. Like what we have now is it's an elevated knowledge base across our teams where folks can spot a compliance issue and then feel safe and empowered to come raise it with me and my team, and we can all work together to solve it. And so it really, if you can find a way to get the level of buy-in where folks are actually like out there as champions of compliance and not just kind of doing the necessary, that will that will just help from the compliance culture standpoint across the board.
That's great advice, and I think that's a great way to really make security a team sport. They all have a role and they understand it. Another thing I found is really successful with this is getting the company to understand how a compliance, like a strong compliance program, can actually benefit them in each of their departments. So, like for engineering and product, maybe this means a more secure product, which in turn means them having to spend less time fixing security issues, and they get to spend more time building and innovating and doing what they were hired to do. And then for sales and customer success, a strong compliance program can maybe help us win deals or like retain customers. So it kind of makes all of our jobs a little easier, maybe, or better. I'd like to chat next a little bit about the different compliance frameworks and certifications. At Ironclad, we have a number of ISO and CSA certifications. We also have like a SOC 1 and SOC 2 annual reports that come out. But customers and prospective customers are constantly bringing new frameworks and certifications they want to our attention. Lisa, how do you decide what to add to your compliance roadmap?
So for us, we work really closely with RevOps to sort of forecast where we see the business going, what new markets we're looking at, whether it's new verticals or new jurisdictions. Sometimes we have frameworks imposed on us. We had a very prominent client tell us they wanted ISO 27001, or they weren't going to sign the contract. And so we had sort of ongoing conversations for a long time, not a long time, but internally about whether or not we were going to sign up for that. Ultimately, we did. And so that pushed us into a new framework. We are a federal contractor, so we are also looking at some of the federal contracting frameworks that would be applicable to certain sales of our products. So again, I think from our perspective at SpyCloud, a lot of it is driven by revenue. It is driven by customers. That's just sort of at a framework level, right? I think we still want to, again, as a cybersecurity company, and it's very different for, I think, every different type of company, we do already have sort of a security is a team sport mindset. Security is important. We have a lot of information that is highly sensitive that we want to make sure is protected for the sake of it being protected and not necessarily because the customer has asked us to protect it. So it's sort of a blend of all of those things, which is why we are a cross-functional or even though we all sit under, legal and compliance, we would consider ourselves to be sort of embedded in a bunch of diff teams because we're tracking all of that. And I think one of the ways that we've, managed to move the compliance program through, up leveling is sort of our willingness to what my GRC director calls being the pain sponge. So, we'll get people to say like, we're going to have to do this new compliance, but we'll take on the pain of like tracking it, of putting it in place, of making sure that it gets achieved, so that you guys can just focus on your jobs. Like we'll give you a few tasks that you need to do and we'll take on sort of the pain sponge of moving forward, which isn't exactly tied exactly to this question, but is sort of, again, in a determination of how are you going to do it. You also need to decide who's going to do the work. And so if you can really step up with your team, even if we're small, we're mighty, and take on the pain of implementing a new framework, it's a lot easier to decide, okay, as a company, we're going to pursue that framework.
Oh, I feel that. I feel like that's a role I often step into. I'll organize
the pain,
I'll tell you what
the
you
pain
need to
sponge,
do, but you don't have to think about it. The pain sponge. I like that term. It sounds like you probably get many asks at the same time. Do you have any tips for prioritization? And then I want to hear Martha's perspective on this as well.
So we sort of assess from what frameworks do we have that we already comply with that could be sort of incremental to helping us get to the new framework compliance objectives. Also sort of revenue prioritization, which of these is being driven by, if we really need if we're bringing in a Fed contract this year, do we need to, get NIST 800-171 compliant like this year? How does that look for maybe a couple of years from down the line, getting FedRAMP compliant? So we work again really closely with the revenue operations and the sales teams to sort of forecast what that looks like, so that we can plan our own roadmap.
Martha, what about you? How do you prioritize different asks and how do you decide what gets added altogether to the roadmap?
Yeah, as Lisa mentioned, a lot of it is customer driven. And I would say there's no one single formula. It really is a balancing act where you're weighing risk cost and risk, cost, and benefit, right? And typically in that scenario, and especially if I'm trying to figure out prioritization, um, probably I'm talking about some sort of trade-off, right? Like if I'm going to focus on this one thing, it means I have to pull back on something else because resources are, kind of limited to a certain extent. And so at that point, the best thing I can do is make sure that I'm not trying to make these decisions in a vacuum, but really engage with the business, especially those people who are close to for where we want to be going during the year, and we just make sure we're aligned with those business leaders and make sure that the trade-offs we're making are in line with the bigger picture.
I think that's all great advice. I want to switch topics. I'd like to talk about maintaining the compliance function at your organization. We've talked about building it, deciding what we're going to add to it. Let's talk about maintenance because that is a huge part of compliance. I think we all have pretty small compliance teams. If you even have a team, maybe you just have a program or a function like Ironclad. I'd like to talk about how we enable that team to stay small while still getting everything done and still adding to our program. Martha, how do you support your small team? Are there any tools or third parties that you would leverage for compliance initiatives?
We do use, so our company was already had a lot of experience using Jira and kind of the ticketing system, the cards that you can use in Jira. And I'm probably if I talk more about it, I'm going to put my foot in my mouth because I had to learn Jira once I joined the company. But it's been a really valuable way for us as a small team to quickly basically track some metrics, which is something that no one really we don't have a dedicated ops person, and we're nowhere close to being able to do that. And so having like a card system to track tasks and actions that different team members are engaged with means that we can divide and conquer, but then kind of see what one another is working on, but also gather that data so that at the end of the day, we can turn around and say, hey, here's some impact that we can report on and say, what have we done? Because that can be really hard too, kind of showing to the business how valuable your team is, and especially how far you're going with so few resources. That's a hard story to tell sometimes when often the success story is the absence of a problem, right? Like that's like, it's really hard to say like, well, we didn't, these things didn't happen. And how do I prove that it's, thanks to a lot of the work we've done. So anyway, Jira has been really important for us as a small team to kind of manage our workload, keep eyes on one another's work, and also kind of gather that data. I will say one other thing, something we've been focusing on in the last 12 to 18 months has been trying to build out more self-service support for certain aspects of what we do. So for example, our privacy lead has like built out a bunch of documents and kind of training modules, et cetera, for folks to go and bring, like if a customer asks a privacy question, we've got a whole set of resources now where folks can go find the answer for themselves and then go continue the conversation with the customer without waiting for someone on our team to get back to them. And I think it goes back also to that empowerment where our team members now feel more in the know and more engaged in the answers they're giving because they're actually the ones who are sourcing the answer and providing it.
Oh, that's cool. I also loved your comment on like metrics and data. I feel like those are not words that are often used to describe the work that a legal team or legal compliance function does. So I love that you're bringing that in. Lisa, what about you and your team? Any like tools or third parties that you found particularly helpful?
Sure. So we have been fortunate to, be able to use some consultants when we're setting up new frameworks to help us do sort of our gap analysis or set us up with milestone plans in order to achieve certain frameworks. And that's always great. We recently started using Vanta within the last year, and we really love that. in addition to sort of helping us sort of operate our controls and sort of see that visually, which is really helpful for a lot of people when you're talking about control operation and maintenance and this and that and the other. Just see like a little green dot that you're like, yes, this is working, is amazing. And it's really helped us, drive in buy-in from other teams where they're like, I want my dot to be green too. And the trust center that they have has really helped us speed up the sales cycle, right? So again, compliance, we're a very revenue-driven organization, with the additional attention to vendor security and security questionnaires that we were starting to get, it was really slowing down the sales cycle. So having a trust center where we've, authorized prospective employees and prospective customers and current customers to go get and self-service externally a lot of the documentation that they want about our organization has been really helpful in shortening that element of the sales cycle so that we can get to, close faster. And the plus side of that is going back to the data and metrics that Martha was talking about. It's helped us really drive real numbers or put real numbers behind some of the activities that we're doing, right? So we can say we got this many questionnaires and the cycle time for them was, 2 days, whereas before it used to be 2 weeks because somebody had to manually answer like all of those questionnaires. And that's been really helpful to sort of prove out the value, not only of our tools, but also of our team, because somebody had to do all the work to set that stuff up. So
that's great. I also use Vanta, and I've found it very helpful to have for me and how small our compliance function is and feeling like a bigger company.
I'm also going to plug Ironclad because we do use you guys in our compliance. So in addition to, contracts, running all of our contracts through Ironclad and being able to pull the data out of that, seeing all of the approvals, the activity history, so where people have questions, they get answered, and having that all within the workflow has been valuable, really valuable. I think we've been with you guys for like 3 years now. But we also set up an entire workflow for evaluation and approval of, opportunities that would be deemed typically outside of our risk thresholds. So, somebody submits the opportunity for review and then the risk committee, considers it, we approve it, and we use that to sort of store all of our information there. So that's been sort of a outside element of our compliance program that we've incorporated with you guys. So yay for Ironclad.
Yeah, that's great. I think we also try and similarly use our product for compliance related initiatives like that. So I'm happy to hear it.
Yeah.
So before we jump into our live Q&A, I have just like one more question for each of you, and that is related to the fact that there's constantly new challenges popping up in the compliance landscape, new laws, new frameworks, new technologies that warrant a new interpretation of existing laws and frameworks. So I'm curious, Martha, like what's top of mind for you this year?
That's a big question. I think most of what we're focusing on now is evolving what I think is now a pretty solid, kind of foundational compliance program. So, just I'm trying to think of like specific examples, but like the move towards self-service modeling was like a big push in the last year. It's something we'll probably continue to focus on. And right, that wasn't necessarily us like moving into a new compliance space. It was more about like becoming more efficient as an organization, so that we can be ready for when, the AI regulations drop, or like these these really heavy heavy frameworks for us to kind of sort through. And so I that probably wasn't that concrete an answer, but I think just like constantly iterating on what we have to try to become more efficient so that we're ready to like pivot and kind of jump in on things when they inevitably surprise us, or jump out of the woodwork.
I think that's great. Efficiency is so important, and it's almost becomes its own compliance initiative. Are we efficient in our maintenance efforts? Are we efficient in just like everything that we've got going on and what we're going to add? And I think that's hugely impactful. Lisa, what about you? What are you prioritizing in terms of compliance this year?
I think for us, it's getting FedRAMP ready, right? So that's almost going to be inevitable, laying the groundwork for that for us. And that's a big shift, a big conversation, and one that we've had ongoing at sort of a low level for a couple of years, but is something that was, moving to the forefront. As Martha said, AI on the horizon. And because I'm responsible for all of the legal matters at the company, that also includes sort of forecasting how this would affect maybe perhaps an eventual exit or IPO. So being a bit of a prognosticator on how AI is going to impact our operations, and making sure that we're appropriately tracking all of that while not being fully informed of all of the regulations because they haven't been published yet. Has been a really fun and interesting challenge, one that I hope not to repeat in my career. And then again, like Martha said, just sort of how do we keep our program in a maintenance mode but not stagnant, right? So making sure that we're trying to find the efficiencies and moving it forward, in a way that's sort of cost effective, and still viable for our bottom line.
Great. I feel like I just could echo everything that has been said, and that is, similarly what we're focusing on.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, everyone, we're ready for our live Q&A. I see one question in the chat. Everyone else, feel free to drop any other questions. Otherwise, we'll start with the one that we do have and go from there. But the first question we have is on compliance training. This person wants to know how much training we should require each year and what kinds of subjects we should be looking at. And then our risk assessment is something that we do as well. I'm going to send this to Lisa first. What do you think?
Sure. So I'll start with the risk assessments. Yes, absolutely. That's something that we do. That's a process that Leah manages. She manages it really well, to the point where I mostly just have to sign off on what she's done. But it is something that you should be doing. I think, whether you're a team of one, whether you have half a head count to be able to devote to this, knowing where your risks are, being able to identify them, to me is just totally invaluable, because otherwise you don't know where your gaps are, you don't know where you're weak. So doing continuous risk assessments in various verticals across the company is absolutely something that you should be doing, and finding out a way to make time and treasure devoted to doing. That didn't make any sense. As far as determining how much compliance you should require each year, for us, that's really driven by the frameworks that we adhere to, right? So I believe it's ISO 27001 certification requires a certain amount of training, including a data handling component. And so that's something that we've aligned to. Fortunately, we use a tool called KnowBe4 to do our trainings, and that helps us really align with certain frameworks, and has been helpful in getting us compliant in training.
Yeah, I'd echo you. For us, training is contingent on what compliance frameworks we're complying with and any laws that we're subject to. Martha, anything to add on trainings and risk assessments?
Mm-hmm.
No, well, echoing, absolutely. It kind of depends on the frameworks that you're operating in and the industry. So, our company being in the clinical research space or supporting researchers, we want to make sure that our teams are conversant in the sensitivities that our customers have. And so even beyond the baseline, these are legally required, you have to take these, because that bucket exists and it's always going to exist. There's also the how do we create a workforce that is sort of inspiring confidence in our customers and is able to be responsive to customer needs. And then finally, of course, the code of conduct, making sure that you're hitting not just kind of the data stewardship and kind of framework-based compliance, but also the ethical compliance that and kind of the behavioral compliance that you also need to have a healthy workplace.
That's great. The next question we have two more questions, but they're pretty similar, so I'm going to group them together. What resources do each of you rely on to keep you informed and up to date on everything that you need to kind of keep relevant on? Lisa?
I've never found a way that is super consolidated and informative. It's sort of cobbling together a bunch of different resources. So if there's somebody who knows a good answer to this question, I would love to hear it, because I spend a lot of time I used to spend a lot of time on a daily basis. Now I sort of consolidated. I block out a couple of hours, like one day a week, to sit and go through all of the newsletters and bulletins that I receive. We have a subscription to Practical Law, so I have a variety of bulletins from Practical Law that I receive. As various states pass data privacy laws, we get updates on those. Your outside counsel is also always going to be a really good resource. They typically send out bulletins weekly about topics that would be of interest to you. And really, it's just sort of sitting, reading them all, and then synthesizing them in preparation for my own weekly report to our leadership team. That is the most valuable thing for me.
Martha, what about you?
Yeah, I'll put a plug in for the IAPP for anyone who's operating in the privacy space. That is a wealth of information, and they've got some pretty good sort of email newsletters that can keep you posted on developments in the data protection space. Beyond that, and kind of the resources that Lisa mentioned, I would say building out a strong, network of peers is really important. So I belong to a few different kind of professional networks. One of them specifically dedicated to general counsels in the tech space. And I find, I go to the events, I just get to know people and talk to them. And I can't tell you how many times I've learned, just from like the scuttlebutt conversations, like, what are you worrying about? Oh, maybe I should worry about that too, and vice versa, right? And it's that community building that that can also just be a really good resource for what's new and out there.
Yeah, Martha, I think you and I are members of the same one. So yes, those conversations are invaluable. And it's been something that I've been trying to consciously do since, the pandemic, is get back out there. And it has been really helpful, and it is a lot easier once you get to talk to people. So I would also recommend doing that.
Yeah. I also want to second the IAPP recommendation. That's my go-to for a lot of information in the data privacy and security space. And then also, I think earlier we mentioned kind of arming the company with the knowledge of like the why behind, the different compliance initiatives and like why they're important and why we should all care. And it kind of arms the company to be on the lookout for issues. I think that's a good strategy here too. I can't tell you how many times I get on Slack in the morning and I've got someone in a not legal or security related department pinging me saying, hey, did you see that so-and-so passed this law? It's helpful to have other people on the lookout for these issues at the company. Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, that was our last question. So I would love it if each of you could maybe leave us with a piece of like parting advice, and then we'll let everyone go. So Martha, what's like one like takeaway or piece of advice you want to share with the group to leave this webinar with?
Just real quick, are you able to still hear me, Nicole and team?
I can hear
I
you.
think it's my internet.
Okay, it went away. I had a pop-up that said I had an unstable connection. Sorry, everyone. I know. So, parting advice, I go back to the be authentic and be human. I just be your authentic self, and I think everything will follow. I mean, you're going to bring the expertise. You're going to have your eye on, on the priorities that, that require attention. It really is at that point about consensus building and team building. And so just falling back to that is always going to help you, whatever you're trying to do.
That's great. Lisa, what about you? Parting words, parting advice?
No, I think Martha nailed it, right? Like it really is, when you're in charge of compliance, you're sort of in charge of building and setting the tone for that function across the org. And so it's really important to come at it with authenticity, with openness, with a solutions-driven mindset, right? So, whenever I interview for a job, I always say, I don't want to be the lawyer who says no. I don't want to be the legal tail that wags the business dog. I want to be a business partner and help support the organization as it moves forward in achieving its goals, and sometimes even just articulating what those goals are, right? And so if you can do that in a way that is demonstrable to your leaders, I think you've got a golden ticket, and you'll be able to pretty much put in place everything that you want, so long as you have the buy-in and sometimes the money.
That's great. That's a perfect point to end on. Thank you both for joining me today. And thank you everyone who attended. We really appreciate you joining in on the conversation. But yeah, have a great rest of your day, week, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.